this practice of family separation is not to protect children. It's used as a an instrument to disrupt whole communities. It's a political weapon. And because the government knows that it's a very powerful way of demeaning families, of breaking apart loving ties, and actually harming children in various ways. So, what we can see from this is that we should always be suspicious of a system whose main purpose is to separate children from their families. You could imagine what it's like to have a knock on the door and a caseworker show up and say, somebody, they don't have to say who it was, and it could have been an anonymous call to the child abuse hotline by an angry neighbor, an ex-boyfriend, and someone who just doesn't like you.
All right. Hello, everyone, with the Institute for Black Justice. We are so excited today to have Dorothy Roberts with us. She is just one of the people that we look to for guidance in her books. And so to have her here with us and as our keynote speaker, February 28th, we are just so excited to have her here with us today. And so, first off, I just like to give the floor to Dorothy, kind of just introduce herself, and then we'll go on from there.
Okay, well, thank you so much. It's really an honor and pleasure to be on this podcast with you, but also looking forward to the time that we'll be in person at the conference in February. Uh, so I'm Dorothy Roberts. I'm a professor of Africana Studies, Law, and Sociology at University of Pennsylvania. I also run a program that I launched when I got to Penn. It's called the Program on Race, Science, and Society. And I'm an author as well. I've written the book that you all know about, I guess, that we're going to talk about, right? Torn Apart, how the child welfare system destroys Black families and how abolition can build a safer world. And before then, I wrote a book called Killing the Black Body: Race, Reproduction, and the Meaning of Liberty, about the longstanding regulation of Black women's childbearing. That was published in 1997. And then I wrote a book, kind of a precursor to Torn Apart, called Shattered Bonds: The Color of Child Welfare. And that was in 2001. And then my third book is Fatal Invention: How Science, Politics, and Big Business Recreate Race in the 21st Century. And that's about the resurgence of the false concept of race uh, in medicine and science. And then I wrote Torn Apart, my fourth book, and I have a memoir coming out in February called The Mixed Marriage Project, a memoir of love, race, and family. So that's a kind of uh, nutshell of my books, which I think can give your audience some idea of the kind of topics that I've written about. And I am an activist. Everything I write, I also try to support various social movements that are working on the same issues and hope that my work can be useful to them.
Absolutely. Well, we're excited to dive deeper into I think your new book that's coming out and Torn Apart. So I'll just get right on into it and we can
Right.
go on from there. So today, I like to just say today we are joined by Dorothy Roberts, one of the leading scholars, and she got into this a little earlier, leading scholars on race, gender, and the law. She is the Georgia A. Wise University Professor of Law and Sociology at the University of Pennsylvania, with joint appointments in the Department of Africana Studies and Sociology and the law school. Professor Roberts is the author of several groundbreaking books, which she just discussed with us, including Killing the Black Body, Fatal Invention, and most recently, Torn Apart: How the Child Welfare System Destroys Black Families, and how abolition can build a safer world. Her work exposes how systems of power, from reproductive control to family policing, have been used to surveil, regulate, and tear apart Black and brown families. She is also getting ready to publish a memoir, The Mixed Marriage Project, which exposes love, race, and family across generations. Professor Roberts, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're very welcome.
Thank you. And so, a recent ProPublica investigation from November 2025 found that ICE has sent 600 immigrant children into federal shelters this year, the highest number since record keeping began a decade ago. In around 150 cases, children were taken into federal custody after traffic stops, especially in states like Florida, where thousands of state and local police have been deputized to enforce immigration laws. You spent decades documenting how the foster care system operates as a family policing mechanism for Black families. Now we're witnessing immigrant families, primarily brown families, being funneled into the same system at an unprecedented rate scale. When parents are detained or deported and their children end up in foster care, how does the government create the crisis and then claim it is stepping in to save the child? And what kind of long-term repercussions do you foresee from the massive expansion that the average person might not anticipate?
Yes, I think what's happening to undocumented immigrant families through these detentions, deportations, and then the taking of children, separating them from their families and putting them either in basically detention centers or also into the foster care system. And some of these children have been adopted by families thousands of miles away from where their parents are detained or separated at deportation when their parents are deported. And I think one thing that shows us is that family separation, either through the system of slavery or through the use of family separation as a weapon of war against native tribes, or the modern day family policing system that targets disproportionately Black families and also native families still, uh, or whether it's this current escalation of family separation of immigrant families, mostly brown families. It's all shows us that this system, this practice of family separation is not to protect children. It's used as an instrument to disrupt whole communities. It's a political weapon. And because the government knows that it's a very powerful way of demeaning families, of breaking apart loving ties, and actually harming children in various ways. So, what we can see from this is that we should always be suspicious of a system whose main purpose is to separate children from their families. And we know, I often think we don't even need statistical or psychological evidence. I mean, we know just by thinking about what it would mean to us to have our children taken from us and put somewhere where we don't know where they are, but we know it's worse than at home. This the terror of that, the trauma both to the parents and the children. And it's well documented that these kinds of substitute care for children, as they call it, are harmful to children. It causes trauma. So we can't it just and it disrupts whole communities. So we can anticipate that there's going to be trauma, there already is trauma being inflicted on these families and their children.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, the nation today, we're seeing it. And, it won't be until we kind of get through these mass deportations that we probably really are going to be able to analyze the fallout of what's taking place today and probably in the next few years to come. But let's take a step back and look at the broader landscape of how the state
Mhm.
separates families in America. For decades, Black and brown families have been surveilled, policed, and torn apart by systems that claim to protect children, but often cause profound and lasting harm, which you've just touched on. Dorothy, you
Mhm.
argue in Torn Apart that the child welfare system is really a system of family policing. not family support.
Mhm.
This reframing challenges everything most Americans have been taught to believe about the Child Protective Services. Um, from people hearing the phrase family policing for the first time, what does it mean? And why is it so important that we start calling this system by its real name?
Yes. So, as you're pointing out, there has been longstanding propaganda around child protective services, the child welfare system, foster care, to proclaim that its purpose is to protect children and that the only way to keep children safe is to have a government run system that separates children from their families. I I think most people think that it only intervenes in cases of severe abuse where it's warranted. The children have to be taken away or they're going to end up brutally beaten or killed, and that we don't have another way open except through a system like this. Once you understand it's not designed to improve children's welfare, it's not designed to care for children, it's not designed to support families, it's not designed to make children safer. And you understand that what the system does, how it operates, is to surveil families, investigate them, accuse them of child maltreatment, which we can talk about later, is extremely broadly defined. Uh, when you understand how biased it is, that it targets Black and Native families, then you see that it doesn't make sense to call it a child welfare system or a child protective services. What it does is police families. Everything I said is about policing families, surveilling them, and accusing them, investigating them, monitoring them, supervising them, taking children away from families. That's policing. That's policing families. And so the better way to understand it is to call it what it is, a family policing system. And that's important because we're not going to be able to change the way we approach child and family support if the public believes that there's no need for change. In fact, many people think that if anything, there should be more removal of children. There should be more surveillance of families, as long as it's not their family. As long as it's our family, then they can say, uh, take more children away, interfere in more families, because they don't think it's gonna happen to them. And so it's important for the public to understand what this system actually does.
Most people understand child removal as the last resort to protect children from severe abuse, and you touched on
Mhm,
that in the last response. Your research
mhm,
reveals a very different reality about why children are actually taken from their families. Why do most
mm.
Americans fundamentally misunderstand about why children are removed from their homes and what's really driving these separations?
Mhm. Yeah, so as I was saying, the whole rhetoric, what the media has promoted, it's changing now, but usually the media does not report on when children are taken from their homes and the trauma it causes to them and their families. It reports the rare, tragic, yes, but they're rare cases where children are killed in the home. They tend not to report when they're killed in a foster home, but, it makes headline national news when a child is killed at home. Uh, and again, it's a tragedy. It should never happen, but it is rare compared to the hundreds of thousands of children who are taken from their homes every year. And, that just a tiny fraction of that involve children who are severely abused. In fact, most children in foster care are there because of neglect, what's called neglect. And neglect is defined in states, every state, one way or the other. There's some variation, but it's basically parents failing to provide some material need for children. So it could be medical neglect. They did not get health care in time, or they treated the child in the way that the doctor said they shouldn't have. Uh, or they just didn't have health insurance. They didn't have the money to pay for care for their child. It could be uh, housing insecurity. They're living in a shelter, or they have too many children for the number of bedrooms in the apartment, or a social worker thinks that their apartment is too messy. I mean, this is literally a grounds that children have been removed, the messy house ground, uh, or they don't have adequate clothing. So it's neglect is any form of failure to provide for children, and the main reason why parents don't provide these things, adequate healthcare, housing, clothing, food, education, for children is because they can't afford it. So, bottom line, children being removed from their homes for neglect is punishing families for poverty. And so the child welfare system in America was designed to monitor impoverished families and low-income families. That's part of the reason why Black families are sucked into it so much, but it's also because of racial bias against Black families and stereotypes about Black families and differences in certain cultural practices of raising children. And so it well documented the racial bias in reporting child maltreatment, and investigating children and families, and separating children, and termination of parental rights. Uh, Again, Black and Indigenous parents are at least twice as likely to have their parental rights terminated as family, white parents. Uh, One statistic that was recently documented that shows that Black families are targeted is the rate of investigation by Child Protective Services of Black families. Uh, this study found that half of Black children, 53% of Black children will undergo a child welfare investigation before they reach age 18. So if you just think
Wow.
about it, that's the right, isn't that crazy? That's the norm for Black children, is to be investigated by Child Protective Services. And in case your listeners don't think that's a big deal, I mean, just the numbers itself should be a big deal. You could imagine what it's like to have a knock on the door and a caseworker show up and say somebody, they don't have to say who it was, and it could have been an anonymous call to the child abuse hotline by an angry neighbor, an ex-boyfriend, you know, and someone who just doesn't like you, or someone who doesn't know what's going on in your house, and they see your child who doesn't have who has, raggedy clothes or looks like they're not eating enough, and they call the child abuse hotline. Or it could be a mother who is she's being abused, and she calls, and I tell the story of a mother like this, she calls the domestic abuse hotline to get help, and they call the child abuse hotline because they find out she has a child in the home. So all of these reasons can lead to an investigation, and an investigation, it's terrifying. It's terrifying, because you know that this caseworker, and sometimes they're accompanied by police officers, could take your child right on the spot because they believe that your child is at risk of neglect. And so this means that they search the home, they open the refrigerator to see what food is in the refrigerator, they look in cabinets, they see how many bedrooms you have for the number of children in the house, they look at how messy or neat your house is. They look at, whether there drugs or alcohol in the house. These things have been noted. Sometimes one study found that for Black families, they just assume there are drugs in the house. They don't even look for it. It's just put down on the forms. They can come in the middle of the night and wake your children up and strip search them to look for evidence of abuse. I mean, this is and they collect all sorts of private information, medical information, educational information, social welfare program information, all this information that's private for most people, but once you're under investigation, the Child Protective Services can demand all of this private information to support or to investigate the claims. Actually, most after an investigation, most claims are held to be unsubstantiated, but the family has gone through all this trauma and the terror of not knowing if they'll be able to keep their children or not. And the return to the children too. I mean, just the insecurity, right, of knowing that and I did a little study that shows that in Black neighborhoods, segregated Black neighborhoods where most child welfare agency involvement is concentrated, everybody knows about this system. So you have little kids that know what the van looks like, and are afraid the van's gonna be parked in their home, whose parents have warned them about what to do, where to hide, when the child welfare workers come along. It's and I have a friend and colleague in activism against the system, Joyce McMillan, who has an organization in New York City, and she said, "What kind of help is it or service is it if you have to hide from getting them?" Obviously, it's not helpful to families.
No, absolutely not. And I think, um, you know, as someone that, we all grow up in our communities and, you have those kids that they just end up being at your house all the time. And that's where
Mhm, mhm.
the community steps in and helps out,
Yes.
and and then, of course, you have the
Mhm,
family foster system. So, as
mhm,
someone whose family consistently kinda participates in showing up and showing out,
mhm,
when necessary, when our
mhm,
family is under, I would
mhm.
say, under attack, because a lot of times,
Yeah,
what happens is the whoever reported them, it end up being false allegations, but then you're so
mhm,
hurt and harmed as a parent to go through the process of maybe even getting your kids back, because you're that fear creeps in and the uncertainty creeps
yes.
in. So, I mean, I definitely, can relate to that from, just even from my own personal family, where we've had to step
Mhm,
up, but then we
mhm.
know and the investigation comes out that it was completely false. And yet there
Yeah,
is still fear from that other family member to say, okay, I think I'm ready to get my daughter or my son back because of X, Y, and Z, but that fear is still there. And the process of even being found innocent, but then you still have to go through
yeah,
certain classes to get your kid back. So
exactly,
it's a
exactly.
interesting and weird system and sad system because of that.
Yes,
You just don't
it
get your kids
is
back.
weird. Right, it is weird because, what I say when I hear your story which is so true, and traditionally in Black communities, grandma, auntie, grandpa, uncle, neighbors would step in to help when a family was struggling. Under this system, though, what happens is when they step in to help, number 1, they might now be investigated, the people who stepped in to help, to see if they're helping in the right way that the system wants them to. I tell the story uh, in Shattered Bonds originally of a woman who cared for her nephews and nieces, and now she's under supervision of the child welfare system, right? Because she becomes a kin foster parent, but that means that a social worker is gonna come now into her apartment and investigate it. And they determined that she didn't have enough rooms in the apartment for these children who were thriving in the apartment, And at one of the children's birthday party in a park, they come in and swoop in and take the children away. And, in that case, she ends up getting them back because they were abused in foster care. And now they had all sorts of psychological problems. They were on drugs, psychotropic drugs. And now these children have been traumatized when what should have just happened is just provide support for families. It just makes no sense to me and to many people, especially the families who've encountered this, to see a traditional custom that has helped Black people survive when we were not in this system because they didn't wanna spend money on Black people. We were excluded from it, and take that and turn it into a source of regulation and supervision instead of just supporting the relatives who are helping their families.
Yep. Yep. 100%. 100%. So I also like to say, like in your book, you show how conditions like poverty, housing insecurity, lack of childcare get legally reframed as neglect, transforming
Right.
systemic failures into individual parent failures. Why is that reframing such a powerful and dangerous legal move? And what does it allow the state to do that it otherwise couldn't?
Yes, I think that is such a good way of understanding what's wrong with this system. It takes what are systemic failures. Why is it that a family has to live in a homeless shelter? Why is it that a family doesn't have money to pay for childcare or healthcare? What those aren't individual flaws. That's because of the kind of system we have in the United States. It doesn't exist in some nations where you have to pay exorbitant amounts for healthcare, housing, childcare, clothing, food that many families simply are unable to afford because they have been left out of the privileges of high quality education, high quality healthcare, high quality, housing. They simply can't afford it, and it's not their fault, but instead of addressing those systemic inequities, instead of ending child poverty in America, instead of ensuring that every family has decent housing, instead of ensuring that we all have high quality healthcare, which this nation could do, it has the money to do it. Has the money. There are individuals in this nation that have the money to do it, who, pay no taxes, and for some reason, I don't know how they get away with it, but, instead of doing that, and I don't wanna say it's just that, it's also social movements. It's organizations like yours that are advocating for structural change, but instead of listening to that approach, how do you get Americans to support this stingy system, this demeaning system that leaves so many children in poverty? And we have the highest poverty rate of any industrial, Western nation. Why is that? And it's so, instead of people questioning that, you tell them, well, no, the harms to children who are not eating well, who don't have adequate clothing, who are living in homeless shelters, who don't living in shoddy, housing, instead don't have health care. And you tell them it's the fault of their parents. The problem isn't social inequality that requires social change. The problem is individual pathological parents who don't know how to take care of their children. That's why, as you pointed out, what's the answer? It's not social change, it's not providing, making sure we have a system, an economy, and a social structure that provides what children needs. Instead, it's, "Okay, you have to go to parenting classes."
Yep.
Right? You didn't have enough money to adequately feed your children, or you didn't have enough, money to afford decent housing. So your problem is you just don't know how to be a good parent. And so how we're going to fix it is make you go to a therapist and and parental training classes. You know, it's
Yep. Yep.
so it's deep. It's deep. But this system operates to distract us from the need for social change. That's fundamentally how it operates. And then what families then are you gonna target for that? You're not gonna target wealthy, powerful, elite families, even though their children may be neglected too. Their parents may be on drugs. Their parents may be alcoholics, right? You know, their children may have all sorts of psychological problems that aren't being treated properly because of their parents. Could be. You know, I'm not trying to say interfere with them. I'm just pointing out that we know it's not just low income and impoverished people who have family problems, but instead, you know, this my point is the system targets the marginalized because the system can get away with putting the burden on them for this whole it's a way of thinking that we don't need any social change in America. We just need to find those parents to investigate and take their children away and put them in a foster care system that's supposed to be better for the children, which we know it's not.
Right, right. And it's so interesting you say that because, at the Institute for Black Justice, we're looking at creating a program, the Institute for Political Power, that will,
Mhm,
one, get our families and our mothers and our fathers engaged in the system to be advocates for themselves when it comes to,
mhm.
advocating at the capitals and getting them
Yeah,
empowered and engaged because their voices need to be heard because these
absolute
stories, these injustice happening
Mhm.
within our families, it's one thing to have us going up there as employees advocating for our families, but it's a different thing when our parents are up there and they're telling their stories about how their kid was
Yes,
taken from them, at birth.
yes,
You wake up
yes,
from a coma, and your kid is about to get adopted. Like, there are
right.
so many stories, and then you have to fight for months to get your kid back out of a system that took your kid, and you weren't even proved, nobody even reported you. It's just you didn't wake up. Like, we have those stories in our, in our community, and,
Mhm.
for us is, that type of injustice, um, is just it's happening all over the place. And, when we're talking about, the family policing system doesn't operate in isolation, right? And that kind of brought me into,
Yes.
why we need to empower our families. Um, but
Mhm.
it's deeply interconnected with other systems of surveillance and control. How do police,
Yes.
courts, the child welfare agencies work together in ways that most
Mhm.
people never see? What does that coordination look
Yeah.
like on the ground?
Yeah. Well, they're deeply coordinated, uh, partly and it goes to the school system, it goes to hospitals and clinics, partly because the way the parents gets trapped in it is reporting to the child abuse hotline. And so the system is relies on a network of what's called mandated reporters, and anonymous calls to a child abuse hotline. But people are reporting families, and as I've mentioned, they report them in highly biased ways. And so you have, and what's you use the word weird about this. What's weird about it, I think pathological about it, is that the very systems that are supposed to be helping families, teachers, doctors, nurses, social welfare programs, they are the ones that are reporting families in need. So instead of these systems that are supposed to be helping figuring out how to help families, they instead call up, pick up the phone and call the child abuse hotline, putting these children into harmful situations. So that's one way that all these systems are connected. But police in particular are deeply entangled with caseworkers and other uh, actors in the family policing system in so many different ways. One is kind of the way of thinking. I call them both carceral systems because they're based on punishment. They're not really based on helping people. They're based on accusing, detaining, that just the way that police arrest and move people into prison is like the way that caseworkers investigate, take children away, and move them into foster care. So there's that way of thinking, again, to punish people for their status in society instead of supporting them because they have unmet needs, punishing them. So there's that logic to it. But then in concrete ways, in many places, police and caseworkers, social workers train together. They work together. There might be a social worker in the police station that's ready to go after a family. I mentioned earlier, sometimes accompanied by a police officer. So, uh, very often, if a caseworker arrives at a home and says, "Let me in," which you don't have to do under the Fourth Amendment, just like you don't have to let a police officer in your home without a warrant. Caseworkers rarely show up with a warrant, even though they're required to under the Fourth Amendment. And they will, you say, "No, I know my constitutional rights. Where's your warrant?" They will often leave and come back with an armed police officer to frighten families into letting them in. So there's that. When they come to take a child away, imagine, just think about the situation. You have a caseworker coming into the home to take your child away from you. Obviously, most parents are gonna be distraught, and some of them are going to try to keep their child, and so a police officer may be called in to force this separation. At the very beginning of Torn Apart, I tell the story about a mother whose child simply strayed away from her at the park. She could see him for about a minute, and a stranger called the child abuse hotline, I'm sorry, called 911, called the police, wouldn't let the child back to the mother, and the police officer issued the mother a misdemeanor child abuse ticket. Now, the caseworkers show up at her house. She doesn't hear them because she's in the basement washing clothes, and the caseworker calls police officers to come and back her up and enter the home. Guns drawn, guns drawn. This poor woman ends up being put in hogtied, they called it, with her hands and her legs tied behind her. They carry her, they dislocated her shoulder, and now she's under the supervision of the family policing system, all because her child strayed away. And this is also an example of the racism in, you know how many parents have their child run away from them, that they have to run and catch up with them? How does that become misdemeanor child abuse? How does that become cause? This woman now, she was trained to be a nurse. She can't get a nurse's license because she's on the child abuse registry in Colorado. So her children are they were traumatized seeing what happened to the mother. They were traumatized. Okay, so that's just some of the ways that police and the whole policing system and the family policing system coordinate together because they operate under the same kind of philosophy, which is a punitive one. And it enhances the powers of both because now the police officer who needed a warrant to search the home shows up with a caseworker, and now by threatening, "We're gonna take your children away," they're let in, and then the caseworker's powers are strengthened by having an armed police officer next to them when they come to enter the home or investigate the home or take children away from the home.
Wow. I remember reading those stories and in your
Mhm,
book, and I feel like now more than ever we're starting to see more and more of those stories happening. And so, if our true goal is to keep children safe and families together, we would need
mhm,
to fundamentally reimagine how we invest resources and respond to families in crisis, rather than
mhm,
funding investigations and removals so heavily. Where should funding
mhm.
be going?
Yes. Well, it should be going toward providing those material resources that families are being punished for not having. If there are families without electricity or in overcrowded crowded situations or other insecure housing, families who can't afford medical care or adequate clothing or nutrition, the answer seems to me pretty obvious. Provide it. Provide it to them. If they have family members who could help out, support the family members. Don't put them in the system too. And these are just simple answers, that I think are pretty easy to do because just taking the 30 plus $1 billion that's spent on the child welfare system nationally every year, just divert that money into resources for families. I am convinced children would be safer and healthier if we did that. But I think we need even more fundamental change, which is to figure
Yeah.
out how we can end child poverty in America.
Yes.
Figure out how we can have decent housing for everyone in America. In other words, this system waits until there's a crisis and then steps in. How can we have a society where you don't have the crisis to begin with? You you don't need to have a child abuse hotline because families are being supported. And, some people will say, "Well, what about the ones that are being severely abused?" Okay, first of all, let's recognize that that's a minority of children who are being taken from their homes. And also, let's recognize that if we had a society that actually supported families, there would be far less abuse of children. And there are
Absolutely.
other ways to deal with it than traumatizing the children, making it worse. And there are people, including people who are survivors of abuse, who are figuring out what's called transformative justice approaches to dealing with violence in families. This is not about ignoring it. It's about what is actually an effective way to address it because the way it's been addressed for decades in the United States isn't working. It's not working, so why hold on to something right? Why hold on to something you know isn't working? I try something that's been proven to be better for children than what we have now. And by the way, I'll just add that we know that when families got checks in the mail during the COVID pandemic, especially the lockdown period, child poverty went down. I mean, I always say, "What, do you really need a study to show that?" But there were studies that showed it, and children's welfare improved. So, we know right away one way of improving children's welfare is increasing the income that families have. But as I mentioned, there are other structural changes that need to be made, but we can do that. We can do it.
Absolutely. And it's it's so true. As I sit back and I think about, how money flows through the system. And, even when children are placed in foster care, they come with a check that could have gone to the family that needed it, and they
Yes,
would have had everything that they needed to care for the child.
exactly. It's very telling.
Yeah, it is. It really, really is. And, I just look at all of that and I'm like, man, that child could have stayed with the family if that mother or that
Mhm,
father had that little bit of income, that came
mhm.
with the child, after they were taken. And so, like you said, when we were talking
Yeah,
about where should the funds be going instead? You're already going to be putting out funds for that child. Why not at least test what it would be like if you
exactly.
put that into the home and then seen how that would have improved the family altogether.
Yeah.
Um,
Mhm.
but as we, as you're producing new books and new content, I wanted to kind of pivot a little bit and talk about your new book. So, in your
Mm.
new memoir, The Mixed Marriage Project, um, it explores love, race, family across generations. So, what made you decide
Mhm.
to tell this story now? And I know it hasn't been released yet, so of course we would love a teaser on what's in the book and what we can be looking forward to with your new book coming
Sure.
out. Because as you know, at IBJ, we love every book that you put out. So we would love to hear
Well,
more
thank you.
about this next book.
Sure, sure. So this book comes out of my discovering my father's research. He interviewed black white couples in Chicago, I thought during the 1960s while I was growing up. And he was always writing a book on this topic, which he never published. But
Wow.
throughout my entire childhood, he was writing the book. And when I first went through his papers, which I inherited, I discovered that he started the project not in the 1960s and not after he met my mother. So my father was white, my mother was black. She was an immigrant from Jamaica. And I thought that he got interested in interracial marriage when he fell in love with her and married her. But I find out that actually started in 1937. His very first interview was in 1937, uh, when he was a 21-year-old master's student at University of Chicago. And he interviewed over 100 couples in the 1930s, 25 of whom were married in the 1800s, the late 1800s. And these were all black-white couples. They were all living in Chicago's Black Belt because black people couldn't live in the white neighborhoods, and so if you married a black person, you had to be living in the black neighborhood too. And they're just fascinating interviews, but he went on to continue interviewing through the 1960s. He actually went on into the 1980s. I focus on his interviews in the 1930s, 50s, and 60s. So a lot of the book is telling the stories of these black-white couples in an era where even though Chicago had repealed its anti-miscegenation law, there were still all sorts of I mentioned residential segregation was one, but police officers breaking up homes, courts, the vice court, that if the judge believed that it was illicit to have an interracial marriage, putting the black husband in prison, all sorts of ways that they tried to break up and discourage these marriages. And so I use it as a way to reflect on the meaning of love across racial lines. I had a disagreement with my father growing up. My father promoted interracial marriage. He thought that was the answer to racism in America. And I always disagree. Even when I was little, I disagree with him. So I take up this question of whether interracial intimacy is necessarily an antidote to racism, because I find in the interviews, I mean, some of the people were racist themselves. Some of the things the white women said about, so-called colored women, terrible, terrible. They
Wow.
excluded Black women from their club. They, and many of them wanted to have white appearing children who could pass, so they wouldn't marry a dark-skinned Black person, they marry a light one, hoping that the children would be so fair that they could pass as white, and they bemoan the disadvantages that their colored that was a term used, colored children had, as if their children deserved what other Black children didn't have. Do you know what I mean? They deserve more.
Yeah, yeah.
It's interesting. In the '60s, my father and his students interviewed leaders in the civil rights movement. I was so surprised to find this out, and it gets into, well, should a Black leader of the civil rights movement have a white wife? What does that mean? Just all these questions about interracial dating and marriage. I point out that Black women are the most disadvantaged on the digital dating market. We are excluded more than any other group of women, including by Black men. Not all the time, obviously, but Black men are the only group that exclude their own race of women. Just
Wow.
painful, right?
Yes, it
Painful.
is.
And so I pick up all of that in this book, as well as reckoning with my own identity as a Black woman with a white father, and I talk about in college, I hid the fact that I had a white father. I didn't want anyone to know, and, uh, coming to terms with that later in life. And ultimately, I write that I think my father, my mother also, and I were ultimately on the same mission of asking how do we love each other as equal human beings
Mm, yeah.
in such a racially divisive society? And I think that's a question for our time. Whether you're, romantically involved with someone of another race or not, just this question of what does it mean to love each other equally? As equally valuable human beings. That was ultimately the message my parents gave me, that there's one human race and we have a common shared humanity, and we need to love and respect each other regardless of what categories we're put in.
Absolutely. I come from a very multi-diverse cultural family myself, and you know, I I think it would be so interesting to read this book and, definitely share it with my family because I'm sure they've had very similar questions, and just to
Mhm.
see the research and to see all that your book kind of gleams light to. So I'm really excited to see to read the book and share it with family for sure because and for a lot of I know a lot of families in the Washington area. So we are very mixed group here in Washington. So I think it's going to
Yeah.
be amazing to see to read your book, your upcoming book. Um and so I know we're kind of winding down a little bit. But I'm gonna have two of the last questions. So
Oh, okay.
uh when you speak at IBJ's Liberation Gala, what do you want
Mhm.
people in this room to feel responsible for at the end of your speech?
Mhm.
And I think
Mhm.
what do you think the key takeaway will be or should be?
Yeah, yeah. I think the key takeaway will be, first, learn more about the family policing system and other systems that it's entangled with, so you can understand the reality of how these are targeted at Black families and harm our families, our children, our communities, and then a call to do something about it. And there's so many things you can do, beginning with finding an organization. Well, here's one right there, IBJ, right? And I'm so grateful
Yes, yes.
that you're gonna do something. Get involved with I you don't even have to look far. Get involved with the efforts that IBJ is doing to envision, to reimagine how we should be caring for Black children and their families.
Absolutely. I believe that that's an amazing takeaway for everyone there, and just, one, just get gleaming a little bit into to what drives the mission of IBJ. I know I spoke to you a little bit
Mhm.
before we started recording about how your book is given to every employee that works at IBJ, and it is a foundational tool that drives our organization. So, um, just again, thank you. And so I just want to leave with this last question: what is the best way for viewers to stay connected to you and keep up with your work?
Yes. Well, I do have, my own personal website, which is dorothyroberts.com, and then I'm on Threads and X and Instagram, all Dorothy E. Roberts. Although I was saying I think there are ways that these not Instagram, but Threads and X, that they somehow filter out certain kinds of messages, because I've noticed a change, in the last 5 years.
Yes,
Them
there
or
has been.
I've noticed a big change, so there's that. And then also I am a professor at University of Pennsylvania, so I have, a website on the Penn Carey Law uh, website, a web page on there, which, if you Google Dorothy Roberts, University of Pennsylvania, especially the law school has a detailed web page for me with information about my scholarship and uh, mostly scholarship because it is the law school, courses I teach, that sort of thing.
Nice.
The My personal website has a little bit more, but those are ways you can keep in touch with me. I don't necessarily recommend trying to contact me by email or phone only because they're swamped, they're overloaded, and I probably won't be able to get to it, but, and then my book is available for pre-order, so and I think it'll be I I don't wanna speak out of turn, but I believe it'll be sold at the conference as well, at the
Yes,
gala as well, and I'd be happy
absolutely.
to sign
Absolutely,
anyone's
everyone, make
copy.
sure you grab Dorothy Roberts' new book, at the gala. So you guys all want to be there to hear her speak, and definitely grab her new book. But thank you, Dorothy, for joining me today, and for
Oh, you're
just
welcome.
being a trailblazer in this industry. And so we want to do all we can to get the word out about family policing, and the importance of knowing exactly what it is. And one, you're right. When people come to your door, and
Mhm,
what you can stand on. And so definitely looking
mhm.
forward to hearing more of that at the conference, as our parents will be there and community members will be there. And like you said, what, half, 53% of Black and brown families would
Yes.
have encountered the family welfare system, family policing system. And so this is huge, as we are sitting there at that gala, and we're looking around at one another. That means half of us in that
Yeah,
room could be impacted. So
mhm. Yeah,
thank you again, and I'm going to just stop right
you're
here.
welcome.